My name is Pawel Bernat. I teach at the Polish Air Force University. I'm a senior lecturer, and for 6 years now, I've been working on safety and security of outer space, and space terrorism is one of the fields of my expertise. As you have mentioned, okay. This is a relatively new field of study, although the phenomenon is not that new. So like we can trace it back actually to the 1980s, it relatively wasn't that significant from the perspective of national or international security. But now what I will try to, what I will argue actually for today is that this phenomenon is growing in significance. So the topic of my presentation today is Decoding Space Terrorism, which is, by the way, the title doesn't come from me, but I think it is excellent. So I added a subtitle, Conceptualization and Threat Analysis. So this is a quick agenda, what I'm gonna talk about today. So like, you know, I really wanted to start with trying to, or like presenting you a few definitions. There haven't been many so far, and I'm actually working right now on a better definition, I guess, because, you know, like 3 years back, I came up with a definition of space terrorism. But as you can imagine, you know, the evolution has been quite quick lately. And then I'm going to talk briefly about, you know, the terrorist motivation, why they would engage in space terrorism. And then I'm going to just move strictly to space. So I'm going to talk about the potential targets and how they can be targeted. So what are the potential actually, and the potential methods of attacking space sector, so to speak. Then I'm just go very briefly through case studies, and then I'll conclude with threat assessment, current and future threat assessment, although this is qualitative threat assessment. So I'm not going to present you with like some particular numeric data on that. So as I have mentioned already, this is a relatively new phenomenon. And to be honest, not so many people, researchers, have been working on that. Obviously, national space agencies have their own documents where they try to define this issue. But like on the academic side, there hasn't been much work done so far, at least. So I'm not going to read all those definitions. I'm just going to read this mine working definition that I think, obviously, because it is mine, describes the phenomenon in best terms. Although, as I said before, I'm still working on it, and you know, I'm going to publish a paper on that. It should be published this year still. But what do we mean by space terrorism? On the margin, I'd like to say that all the previous presentations, they dealt and described different areas of terrorism, and their meaning or definitions have been really well established, because, you know, those like biological, nuclear threat and so on, or like just using conventional weapons, have been there for a long time, and you know, in a much greater scale, contrary to space terrorism. And so what do we mean by space terrorism? We could define it as a purposeful and well thought out act of destruction against human and or material resources of space industry or space sector, undertaken by individuals or groups out of ideological motivation, where space industry is understood as an economic sector dedicated to producing components that go into Earth orbits or beyond, delivering them to those regions. That means launchers, you know, rockets basically, and related services. And the related services, when we talk today about space terrorism, this is actually the most crucial part of it, because it is the most vulnerable. Obviously, there is no one space terrorism definition, and there will be no one definition, just like with terrorism. By the way, there are many parallels between space terrorism and aviation terrorism. In aviation terrorism, again, many agencies, national agencies, governments have their own definitions of what terrorism is, which definition should serve in the best possible way the action of those agency or government. So we should not expect one decisive space terrorism definition. What I predict actually for the future, again, drawing an analogy between space terrorism and aviation terrorism, that there will be a legal attempt to come up with international conventions, like which would define or account certain acts as space terrorism. Again, no such legal framework has been established yet. Obviously, we have within the United Nations, UNOSA, which is agency responsible for space safety and security, but they have not addressed yet, at least, space terrorism in a form of a separate document. Very quickly, what would be the motivation, and what was the motivation of terrorists to target space sector? And there is no such analysis in the subject matter literature, but again, we could draw from the experience of aviation terrorism, so extensive media coverage. We can basically imagine if such a act of terrorism would take place on space infrastructure, regardless whether it would be national agency like NASA or ISRO or Roscosmos. The media coverage and the symbolic way, heaviness of this act would be massive. And as we understand terrorism, one of the main goals of terrorism, of terrorists, is to cause chaos and unrest, among the public. And again, space industry is relatively new and very important for the nations that have successfully engaged in it. So there's a symbolic meaning would be enormous. Obviously, huge media coverage, but contrary to aviation terrorism, the fact of it's not so easy actually to carry out such an attack against space infrastructure. It's almost impossible for traditionally weak groups like terrorist groups to attack actually space assets in the orbit, for example. But they could attack IT infrastructure, and that has been actually the area that has been attacked the most, which actually goes in line with what General Efrati has said. Terrorists have been pretty active in this area. But the discrepancy, so the difference between the technology you have to have in order to attack, for example, a satellite in a kinetic way, is too large for terrorist groups who are, who do not have such financial or technological potential. But what they can attack is actually this IT infrastructure. Another very important point here is that space terrorism, so attack on space infrastructure, regardless whether in the orbit or the ground infrastructure, has this potential capacity of causing massive massive disruption. It could be on the regional, national, but also international level. I mean, like currently we use the global navigation satellite system in almost every device that we use. Obviously, we have mentioned already mobile phones, right? But we can think of, for example, aircraft navigation, right? We can imagine a situation where navigation infrastructure, aviation, civil infrastructure would be disrupted. That could cause, terrible outcome in the sense of like planes, crashing, for example. So this is another point why space terrorism could be attractive for terrorist groups. What do we mean when we think about space assets, or what would be the possible target of terrorists when it comes to space sector? And here, I have divided. Sorry for just. I have divided the sphere into 3 parts. So we start with space assets. I'm not gonna spend much time talking about this because, as mentioned already, currently, and this is very fortunate, the risk or the threat of space terrorism is minimal due to lack of this financial and technological potential of terrorist groups. But these space assets are basically satellites or constellations of satellites. That includes navigational systems like GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, Beidou, and so on. Communication satellite systems, including space internet providers, which is the fastest growing part of the space sector nowadays, with SpaceX and Starlink's, OneWeb, British, and there are some other constellations like Cooper by Blue Origin. This is again a private American company, but also Russia, China, and I think also India. They have ideas to build such a system that basically, we have internet from other satellites from the orbit. And then we have tracking and imaging satellite systems, very crucial. For example, we can see in the current war in Ukraine how important they are. Like Ukraine's gain higher ground because they have access to this data, and surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence satellite system as well. So they potentially could be attacked by terrorists. What is actually more vulnerable to such an attack is ground infrastructure, and we have had already such attacks. Already, like 1984, there was an attack on ESA, European Space Agency headquarters. 6 people were injured in this attack. And when we talk about ground infrastructure, we basically mean launching pads and national agencies, including employees, but also this growing number of space companies that have been successful in space exploration and utilization, and that includes also their employees. But also, and this is very important to note, that the users are actually most vulnerable. So us, basically speaking. So like, those passengers in this example of plane, which navigation system, was hacked, for example. So we have this huge amount of globally of equipment that receives the information signal from space, for example. And the last part here, we have information technology, space sector infrastructure. And here we talk about the whole nexus, interconnected of both hardware and software, that those systems are built upon both space assets and ground infrastructure. And this is the area that has been attacked the most, because it's easier. It's basically easiest. As it was mentioned already, you don't need much. You just need skill, knowledge, and maybe a few computers and a server, and that's it. How those targets could be attacked? I'm sorry for just, maybe I should have just put no animations. Anyhow, so when we talk about space assets, so basically satellites, we can attack it in two ways, like with this typology. By the way, there are a few different typologies. I don't think it is important for us, but here we have kinetic attacks, which is basically asset anti-satellite weapon systems. And here we can have DA, direct ascent, so basically missiles launch either from ground, from the sea, or from the air, and all those types of weapons, missiles have been produced, or co-orbital weapons, so space. And here I'm not gonna go into like technical details, but basically we could, for example, hack a satellite to enter this collision trajectory, or China and Russia. We know that they have developed such a potential of actually tracking another satellite, and possibly physically just destroy it. And non-kinetic attacks, we could use electromagnetic, laser, and microwave weapons. Both three of them are actually at the very beginning of the development stage. Then again, that requires huge amount of financial, technological, knowledge resources. So space assets, at least for now, are pretty safe in terms of potential terrorist attack. What is not safe, which is shown by experience as well, is ground infrastructure, so space infrastructure on ground, and IT, so IT space sector infrastructure. When it comes to ground infrastructure, we can have kinetic attacks. So just the use of conventional weapon systems. It could be a manpad, so like a even those like small one-man operated launch rockets, and different kinds of sabotage. And when it comes to IT infrastructure, we can have electronic attacks and also cyber attacks, that I'm gonna talk more about this because they are basically much more relevant to our topic today. Electronic attack, we basically have two types: jamming and spoofing. And like I think I have sorry for that, I think it froze. Okay. So how those electronic attacks look like? So spoofing, basically what it does, it creates like a diversion for the signal. It is especially dangerous, for example, for ships. As you can see here on this slide, on this picture, spoofed, like ship, could be military, it could be civilian, can be convinced actually to follow desired trajectory, but in reality, due to spoofing signal, would go the entirely different way. And it has been actually tested, where like captains and crew in general had no idea that their signal were spoofed. Yeah, so obviously from the terrorist point of view, this is a great solution if they get such an opportunity, right? Because it can cause, again, huge damage. Jamming is a different kind of technology. Again, I'm not going to talk.
Sorry, Dr. Bernat, about 3 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. I'm gonna skip that. So, like, when it comes to cyber, it has been talked a lot already. One thing to remember here is that the threat is real, and actually cyber attacks are the most common when it comes to space sector. Attacking a satellite or any kind of actually piece of infrastructure doesn't have to mean its physical destruction. So here we have degree of severity. It's enough to disrupt, deny of the service, this piece of infrastructure should provide. And when it comes to space terrorism, we basically so far, have witnessed this the first and the second level of this degree of severity, which is, the temporary partial impairment of the utility of space systems, or temporary full elimination of such a utility, and both of them do not require physical damage. And obviously, InfoWar, this is so delay or deceive. This is actually what has been done most often. Case studies. The thing is with space terrorism that we haven't had a lot of such attacks. This is the first thing. The reason for that is that space sector, when you look at it like globally, is at the very beginning of its development. So there were like traditionally not many centers that would actually pursue this endeavor. But here are just a few examples. One of the most famous ones is actually the Tamil Tigers, an attack in 2005, where they actually were able to hack one of the channels of one of the satellites and just beam their propaganda into Sri Lanka and across the Indian subcontinent. Yeah, so these are probably the most important to be mentioned here. This is a very simplified version of like the potential weapons. So when we look at this, what can be attacked by terrorists? As I have mentioned already, space asset, not so much. Current threat is minimal, okay? Because like assets, systems or anti-satellite systems are actually developed by traditionally most important global actors. So it is USA, Russia, China, India, and possibly Israel also has such a potential. Ground infrastructure, again, things like that happened, but they are really well guarded. So so the current threat is also minimal. When we but when we talk about space sector IP infrastructure, so electronic and cyber attacks, this is when we have already the level of moderate threat. So when you look at the number of attacks that have happened already, and when we take into account democratization of technology, and actually this really low entry level when it comes to financial and technological part, this seems and is actually this area is actually the most vulnerable. I'm really sorry for taking a bit longer time, but that was my conclusion. Thank you very much.